then I think we have more of a basis for a conversation about, is it rational to do, life extensions and refurbishments and other things on the existing units. And part of my concern is we just haven't had that conversation yet, where we've sort of, is this the choice we need to make?
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm interviewing someone deeply involved with advising Canadian institutions on the energy policy for the energy transition. As this has also been a focus of the podcast, I'm looking forward to discussing the best approaches for the country. If you enjoy what you're hearing, please hit like on your podcast app. And if you'd like to join the discussion, please join our Facebook group, The Rational View. Mark Winfield is a professor of environmental and urban change at York University. He's also co-chair of the faculty's Sustainable Energy Initiative and coordinator of the Joint Master of Environmental Studies Juris Doctor program offered in conjunction with Osgoode Hall Law School. He's published articles, book chapters, and reports on a wide range of climate change, environment, and energy law and policy topics. Professor Winfield has acted as an advisor to the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario and Federal Commissioner for Environment and Development. He's also served as a member of the Conseil d'administration, or Board of Directors, of Transition energetique Quebec, a Crown corporation established to implement a low-carbon energy transition strategy for Quebec. He's currently co-editing a volume on sustainable energy transitions for Canada, opportunities and challenges for the UBC Press. Dr. Winfield, welcome to The Rational View.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining me. Could you tell me a little bit about your background? You're involved in environment and law, it seems. What was your career path to get to where you are now?
Well, it's been kind of an interesting one. I completed a PhD in political science at the University of Toronto, dealing with environment policy issues in Ontario and Alberta, of all places, and then worked for 9 years as a research director with the Canadian Institute for Environmental Law and Policy here in Toronto. I worked also within the Federal Environmental Commissioner's Office briefly, which was a very interesting experience, and then worked for 6 years with the Pembina Institute, which is, I think, well-known non-governmental organization that works in the energy field, and then have been a professor here at York University. I think it's now, we're into the 15th or 16th year of doing all of this.
Nice. So what are you focusing on these days? I see you're writing a book on policy. Could you maybe give us a little overview of what your work is focused on now?
Well, work is focused in a number of areas. As you mentioned, the book, which is an edited volume that we're doing for UBC Press, has been a primary focus, and we've been thinking there about a number of themes about the relationship between sustainability, decarbonization, and some of the challenges that exist there. And then also we're faced with a more and more challenging landscape as well in terms of the populist backlash against climate change policy that we've seen in a number of places, including here in Ontario and Alberta and in Europe and other places as well. And then also we now have this variable, this enormous external event of the war in Ukraine, which I think is we're just beginning to grapple with how that is altering the energy conversations and the climate conversations, especially initially in Europe, but now also clearly affecting us as well. I also have written extensively on more specifically electricity policy in Ontario. So looking at the sort of pathways the province has taken, but also perhaps the pathways the province could and should be taking. And that conversation, I think, just in the last week has accelerated in some very interesting ways with the announcements around a life extension at Pickering, a new small modular reactor at Darlington, But there have also been other things that have emerged in the last little while that suggest there are other pathways available for the province if it were to choose to consider them.
I've read some of your work, and you point out that Ontario has no planning or regulatory framework around the future direction of its electricity system. I think this has been a problem not only for Ontario, but the entire world for it seems like decades. It seems to me ludicrous that governments aren't making commitments to emission. They're making commitments to emission levels with no basis in the grids or the systems to get there. Why isn't this a higher government priority? Why aren't they looking at this?
Well, I think that's a good question, and a particularly acute one in Ontario, where we're in fact proposing to not only extend the life and increase the utilization of existing natural gas-fired generation, but also to actually build new gas-fired plants. There seems to have been a disconnect in a sense that we've had fairly high-level commitments around reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The federal government has increased its nationally determined commitment under the Paris agreements to a 40 to 45% reduction relative to 2005, and has said the goal is net zero by 2050. And the implication of that, among other things, would be electrification of transportation, particularly passenger transportation. Heavy freight gets a little more complicated. And then also the other big one in Ontario, and indeed most west of the Ottawa River, will be electrification of space heating as well, which is almost unexplored territory at this stage. And there are industrial sectors around which we will need to move towards electrification as well, some of which are going to be difficult, like steel and certain types of chemicals. But there doesn't seem to be a connection made between that sort of high-level international and national commitment and, well, what does this mean in terms of electricity systems? And what does it mean in terms of potential demand? How would we go about meeting that demand? What's that demand going to look like? In terms of qualitatively, what is it we're really going to be trying to do? And at this stage, we just don't seem to have made, that at the provincial level where the real decisions get made about electricity systems. There are exceptions, but for the most part, the connection does not seem to be there. Where we've seen activity, we've seen some movement towards the phase out of coal, because the federal government has now adopted regulations saying that's going to happen. Mostly then in the direction of natural gas, at least what we're seeing in, for example, Alberta. But beyond that, there doesn't seem to be much of a conversation happening yet.
Yeah. There seems to be the promises are being made without the necessary framework and costing to get there, and it's an important discussion, and some difficult decisions would need to be made. Now, so I know the Canadian government has made some, what I would say, ambitious announcements about hydrogen economy and carbon capture in our energy transition. And some critics I know would say that carbon capture and hydrogen are maybe not the best places to be spending our money to meet our climate goals. And some would say these are projects being pushed by fossil fuel industries to keep their hands in the honeypot. Should these projects be placed centrally in Canada's energy transition strategy?
Well, I think this is a very good question. And the federal government seems to be galloping ahead regardless at this stage. In the last budget from last March, I mean, we saw what will be at least a $1.5 billion tax credit for CCUS in the budget, which was an industry ask. And there may be more as well. I mean, Alberta is also making commitments. And the question has been raised by many people. Indeed, there's a letter from, I think there are more than 400 academics and scientists who questioned whether this was a good idea. I was one of the signatories to that letter, so it was. And I think that the concerns come from a number of different sources. One, of course, being, that at the moment, in particular, the fossil fuel industry is being massively profitable. And so whether it's appropriate for taxpayers to be spending money to subsidize their adoption of carbon capture and storage, I think is significant question that there doesn't seem to be a very good answer to. Indeed, we've been talking about should we be imposing windfall taxes as opposed to should we be giving them new tax subsidies. Beyond that, there is these two bigger questions, I think, with CCUS. One is that it seems, yes, a kind of lifeline to the fossil fuel industry and a way of keeping the upstream segment of the industry viable in a decarbonizing world. That sort of skates around the question of, well, where does an upstream oil and gas industry fit in a decarbonized world? It seems to say, well, they're going to continue to do what they're doing, which is to extract mostly oil from the oil sands, although liquid natural gas becomes another set of questions in all of this. But well, for CCUS, it's mostly oil and oil sands is what we're talking about for the most part. So it leaves that question, it seems to answer the question, well, the sector will continue, and lots of people have asked, well, does that really make sense? Particularly as the sort of other piece of the puzzle is that, the emissions at extraction stage, which is what carbon capture and storage would deal with, are only part of the puzzle. That there's also the question, well, what happens when those fossil fuels are combusted as fuel and in vehicles or in other applications? And they're going to produce a lot of carbon. And of course, in theory, we hopefully are moving in the direction of decarbonizing transportation. And we think about 75% of the oil sands oil is going for transportation. There's that question. And then there's a whole series of technical questions about CCUS, about is it really going to work? I mean, on the scale that's talked about, I mean, is the carbon really going to stay in the ground forever? There are questions about the energy balance in the sense of how much energy you have to use to pressurize the carbon dioxide to be able to put it underground. Lots of folks have argued it makes far more sense in energy terms, well, not to produce the stuff in the first place and do something else. And there are losses in energy efficiency. There are questions about cost. On a coal plant, for example, the efficiency losses, not surprisingly, from effectively trying to cap the smokestack and capture what comes out of it and put it underground, are fairly significant. So that's the CCUS part. That there is a heavy reliance there if you look at the federal government's plans. The hydrogen side is more complicated and more nuanced. I think a different set of questions, although I think it's notable that the biggest promoters of hydrogen pathways, interestingly, are the natural gas industry and the nuclear industry. And that perhaps should be telling us something. The problem with hydrogen, and the federal commissioners talked about this, is that its role in this process may be being somewhat overstated. The problem really is, well, again, there's layers of problems. The big one is that you can't just put hydrogen into the natural gas system and use it as a replacement for fossil methane. There are all kinds of technical problems with that in some cases the materials in the gas grid are incompatible with hydrogen. Most of the end uses we have for conventional natural gas, furnaces, stoves, other things, can't burn hydrogen very readily, that you would need to change a lot of the end use technologies. There are questions about the energy density of hydrogen and how much energy you have to use to make it. And those infrastructures for distribution and use at this stage just don't exist. And as I say, you can't just convert the gas grid to work with hydrogen instead. It's much more complicated.
Yeah, it's hard to store. You have to pressurize it, and it takes a lot of energy, and it leaks out of everything.
Yep, it's very leaky because the infrastructures were designed for methane molecules, not hydrogen molecules. And it is, there are hazards as well. That it's a tricky material. It's very reactive. It's a tricky material to handle. The other, the other sort of, where I think if you look at the more serious literatures around hydrogen, What they're pointing at is that this may be useful, especially but its uses are going to be more niche-like. Like it's going to be in places that are very difficult to decarbonize, that you can't electrify very easily. Steel has been one that's come up a lot. That you can't really electrify high quality steel production. But hydrogen may offer a pathway there. Cement production has been talked about, another one where in some ways the production of carbon is tied up with the physics and chemistry of what you're doing in making the product. It's not just that you're combusting fossil fuels, it's tied up in the nature of what you're doing. Fertilizers, certain petrochemicals have come up as well. Some discussion around hydrogen too in heavy long distance freight. So air, rail, ships, heavy trucks is another one that comes up. Again, these are not everything. These are relatively specific applications of the technology. So that's been part of the concern there, that it's just being oversold relative to what's really feasible or practical. And there's a whole set of other questions: where does the hydrogen come from, and how do you make it?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions here that this brings up. From my opinion, at least, I think there's a good case to be made to look at synth fuel from hydrogen to, so you're using your hydrogen to make synthetic fuel that then uses the infrastructure that we have in place for distribution and, closed cycle if you can do it. There's more cost up front in the fuel generation, or it's a slight loss of efficiency, I guess, because it's an extra process that you have to do. But you don't have the cost of replacing the entire infrastructure of civilization, which is a big price tag.
That could become expensive. Yeah, there is. I mean, there are various discussions about methanation, and using hydrogen as a feedstock there, which could work with the existing natural gas infrastructure, which often the end uses are relatively efficient. But you lose methane through leakage and other things, and so there are possibilities there for sure. One has to look at the energy balance around power to gas type equations always, but those are possibilities that have been discussed. I mean, the Germans think in those terms quite a bit as well. That may be another pathway around with hydrogen that works better with the existing infrastructures and end uses.
Yeah. So you mentioned where the hydrogen comes from as an important thing, and maybe we should explain this in a little more detail. There's they call green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, and maybe you could just expand a little bit on the trade-off there between green hydrogen and blue hydrogen and what those are.
Yeah, indeed, there's an entire spectrum of hydrogen. We should have brought a visual for this. There's red hydrogen and black hydrogen and gray hydrogen and blue hydrogen. There's even turquoise. So the big ones, though, that are getting the most attention, green hydrogen is generally seen to be the least controversial, in the sense that you're basically producing hydrogen through electrolysis of water, and your electricity source for doing that is renewable energy sources. So wind, solar, potential hydroelectric, those sorts of things. So basically low or no carbon production electricity that you're then using as your electricity source. And the theory then is your hydrogen can then function effectively as a storage medium. It's a way of effectively storing the electricity that you've produced from wind or solar, particularly if you're at a time when you don't necessarily need all of it for grid purposes. Gray hydrogen, which has been the more conventional version, is essentially produced from natural gas. And it is a relatively carbon-intensive process. You're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as part of the process. Blue hydrogen is the same thing, but you're then doing carbon capture storage on the carbon dioxide that we produced from processing natural gas. You basically make the hydrogen from natural gas. And with blue hydrogen, you're capturing and storing the carbon dioxide. So it in some ways it's better. in the sense you're not having a direct release of carbon, but it then takes us back into the whole conversation about carbon capture and storage. It's basically it's feeding into a CCUS system, and that again raises all the questions we just discussed about CCUS. So that's seen as potentially less attractive. It's certainly a pathway that the natural gas industry is very keen on, because again they see this is how they part of how they transition into a hydrogen economy and how their feedstock works with that. But as I say, you've got the same either you're doing direct release of carbon, which is what's happening now. Is how you make most of the industrial hydrogen that's made now is gray. It's being made from natural gas, and then the CO2 is just being released into the atmosphere. You would go to blue, to say that just raises the CCUS questions and whether or not that's where you want to go.
Yeah. So the part of the trade is the energy efficiency. The green hydrogen electrolysis is very inefficient, right? It's like 50% or 70. I forget exactly what the number is, and it's a little bit more efficient to get it from methane and using natural gas. It's less costly to make it that way, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It is the trade-off with with the blue hydrogen is that it's going to be potentially cheaper, although once you put CCUS into the equation it gets a little trickier. The general view, at least from what I've seen in the sort of more technical literature, seems to be that if you can do direct electrification, that makes more sense from an energy efficiency perspective. That though there are circumstances when that doesn't work for a variety of different reasons. Simply supply isn't there when you need it. And that's where the power to gas notion comes from, that it makes sense then to use hydrogen as your effectively as your storage vehicle for dealing with the intermittency issues with renewables, for example. So you would tend to use it in applications where you need to have that kind of storage capacity because you don't necessarily have full reliability on the electricity side.
I've heard it suggested that hydrogen cracking of water is something you could do when you have peak generation. If you've overbuilt your renewable infrastructure to deal with the variability, and then while it's peaking, you have a hydrogen factory that turns on for the peak hours and then turns off and waits until the sun comes out again. There's obviously some trade-offs there in terms of the infrastructure usage being somewhat fragmentary.
Well, this is basically what's being talked about. I mean, it's sort of a form of what the economists call arbitrage. But you basically decide if you're a renewable energy system operator, you decide when does it make sense to generate electricity and be feeding it into the grid because demand might be higher. And when would it make sense because grid demand is low, the electricity price is low, it may make sense then to run your plant to produce hydrogen instead and store that and then be able to sell the hydrogen to somebody down the road as for electricity production or for other applications. That would be the basic model. In some ways, you could argue it is optimizing the infrastructure because you never stop generating. It's just you change. It almost becomes like a cogen plant where you're changing what you're producing based on what makes sense at that particular moment. So sometimes it may make sense to make hydrogen. At other times, it may make sense to feed electricity directly into the grid.
Mm-hmm. The recently announced Canada-Germany hydrogen strategy, when Scholz came over and talked to Trudeau, and people suspect he wanted natural gas, and he got a hydrogen strategy instead. The strategy, from what I've seen, relies on building a huge offshore wind farm, bigger than all the windmills built to date in Canada, and using this electricity to create hydrogen through electrolysis, and then using this hydrogen in the Haber-Bosch process to make ammonia, and then shipping that to Germany, and then using the ammonia to put electrons into their electricity grid. And at the same time, the government is asking Canadian farmers to cut back on fertilizer, which is also coming from ammonia. Does this process make sense physically, energetically?
I would put it in the category of needing more thorough analysis. I mean, things happened very much on the fly there. It was, as you described, that initially the intention was I think Mr. Scholl was looking for natural gas. And there was the realization that the natural gas grid mostly stops at Montreal, which is not very close to Europe, and that there's no LNG facilities in Eastern Canada. And there actually wasn't that much natural gas available either. So the conversation switched to hydrogen there. I mean, the only natural gas for export that's on the horizon from Canada is liquid natural gas from BC, which is even further from Europe. So that conversation then sort of flipped in the direction of hydrogen. And yeah, I'm not sure how much this was a political fig leaf to give the chancellor something to go home with, as opposed to a really sort of viable proposal in terms of what we might do off Newfoundland. And the Newfoundlanders, of course, for other reasons, have potentially quite a lot of extra electricity anyway. So that's, with Muskrat Falls. So, in some ways, if you're going to make hydrogen in Newfoundland, that might be the better way to do it, rather than trying to construct a large marine offshore wind infrastructure, which could involve some challenges. I mean, an interesting one from a Newfoundland perspective, and perhaps one where the skill sets are relatively well suited towards, but I think a lot of questions have to get asked about the viability and rationality of that particular plan. The ammonia and methane, and high fertilizer questions is a complicated one, and I would have to admit I'm at the edges of that one and only just getting my head around it myself. That the concern is more greenhouse gas emissions in the fertilizer production supply chain. And there's clearly been some back and forth going on between the agricultural industry and the federal government about what can and cannot be done in that space. I wouldn't be claim to be an expert on fertilizer production enough to be able to say something very useful. I mean, it is where I was somewhat surprised that it is one of the places in agriculture where a lot of the greenhouse gases actually do come from. But I wouldn't sort of, I don't have enough technical expertise on fertilizer production to get into the details of what is and is not feasible. But it did beg that question too about, I mean, I think what happened with the chancellor was a bit of a political fudge at the last minute to come up with something they could say, to give the chancellor something to go home with. I mean, in some ways, I think the part that he went home with that was more useful might be the critical mineral stuff, and the discussions that happened there about mineral supply chains and German automobile manufacturers who are interested in materials for advanced batteries. That one might actually turn out to be the more economically important piece. Raises a whole bunch of questions in and of itself, but that may be the part of that story that has a bit more legs in terms of likelihood of attracting private investment, for example, as opposed to just being backed by governments.
Yeah, and Germany also has, I guess, recently decided to extend their nuclear plants that they had originally planned to shut down because of the energy shortages there. And obviously, Canada is uranium rich. I would think that could have entered into the discussion, because I know that Germany is, one of the reasons they said, we can't continue nuclear because we get our enriched fuel from Russia. But Canada is like one of the largest suppliers. I'm surprised that didn't come up on the discussion.
Well, part of it is, I think, because Canada's uranium supplies are mostly committed. And the other problem is would be the fuel production infrastructure, because the German reactors, as I understand them, are not CANDUs.
Right, they're enriched fuel. So you need the enrichment.
Yeah, you would need the enrichment, which we don't have the infrastructure to do, and we don't have the fuel. It's a very deliberate part of the design of CANDU reactors, is we didn't. They operate on unenriched uranium, which would have certain advantages in terms of fuel production, but also reduces weapons proliferation risks as well, and in some ways more efficient. Not that I'm a total fan of CANDUs, but I'm just making that point. Whereas you'd need a fuel production supply chain, of which enrichment is part, for the German reactors. The other big question in Europe is, well, there's many questions around this, is how much what happens over the next year, and especially this winter, is a bridge. I mean, for the Europeans, it's a question of getting through this winter, versus is this a long-term change in direction around which it would then make sense to build the supply chain infrastructures. And that question's, I think, still unanswered. The Europeans, I think, understandably remain skittish about nuclear, particularly as they're receiving very material reminders about Chernobyl and now Zaporizhzhia. So I don't know where that conversation is going to go in the long term in Europe. I'm not sure the Europeans know. At the moment, they're also putting a very strong emphasis on energy efficiency and renewables, although those are longer term. In the short term, they're desperately building liquid natural gas facilities as well.
And Germany is restarting its coal plants.
And there is a major restart of coal going on as well. So I think the real question, the message from the Europeans at the moment, is that all of this is a bridge, that they have to get through this winter, and we're going to have to do some things we're not keen about to do that, given the situation. That the fundamental calculus that Angela Merkel and others made, that there was sort of a relationship of mutually assured economic destruction between Europe and Russia, didn't work. And now they have over natural gas supplies. It was assumed that neither side could turn off the tap because the economic damage would be so enormous that they couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. And then Vladimir Putin went and did it.
So you think Putin sabotaged the Nord Stream pipeline?
From what I've seen, I mean, obviously the taps were being turned off before that. What I've seen technically is that that the damage was most likely done from inside the pipeline itself. That it was done through one of the maintenance. They send maintenance robots through the pipelines, and I've seen from what I would consider reasonably well-informed commentators that that's the most likely thing that happened. That, of course, that area between Denmark and Sweden is very thoroughly wired for sound, and it would be very difficult to have got a submarine or something in there without somebody noticing. So the suggestion's been made that this was done using one of the maintenance robots that run inside the pipeline. And apparently that can only be done from the Russian side to that section of the pipeline. So there you go.
What's the motive there, do you think?
I don't know. The best one I can think of, and I'm in the realm of speculation here. The best one I can think of was it was a threat to the Europeans that we can interfere with the infrastructure that runs under the Baltic and through the Skagerrak, which is the area between Denmark and Sweden, through which all kinds of telecommunications, fossil fuel pipelines, also big hydroelectric lines between Scandinavia and continental Europe, all run through that area underwater. So that would be the strategic rationale on the Russian side that I would offer. there isn't any rationale for anybody else. The Europeans would have no incentive to blow up the pipeline, and say, at least from what we understand of how it was done, I don't think had the means anyway. So I assume that's my best guess in terms of a strategic rationale. This was Putin trying to say to the Europeans, I can mess with your strategic infrastructure.
Yeah, I've heard some good speculation from commentator Adam Blazowski, who suggested that this might be Putin cutting bridges so that he doesn't get undercut by some of his generals talking to Germany, saying everything will go back to normal after this if you take out Putin.
That's entirely possible too. I mean, I did Soviet foreign policy as an undergraduate, but that was a long time ago. I think an enigma wrapped in a riddle is trying to figure out what's going on at the moment. I think the practical implications for the Europeans, which is the part that affects us most directly, is they've got to figure out how do they get through this winter. And I think it's going to be whatever they can lay their hands on. I think the reality for Canada has been, though, that we've had this realization for reasons we just discussed. There's relatively little we can do materially to help in that time frame. That we don't have natural gas or Simeon oil pipeline capacity to the East Coast. It all goes ultimately through Louisiana. So we can't directly move fossil fuels in their direction. And as for the reason we discussed, there are limitations to what we could do on the uranium fuel supply chains as well in the short term. So, we can give moral support, but even LNG from British Columbia is, years off and carries, of course, an enormous carbon penalty as well. The reality is there's limits to what we can really do to help with that situation. The U.S. is ramping up LNG exports, obviously, and the Europeans are furiously building LNG receiving facilities and also their own internal pipeline infrastructure. But that's in the very short term, meaning the next 6 months that the Europeans have to get through. There's limitations to what we can do. The LNG, there's probably some Canadian gas ultimately making it onto those LNG LNG tankers that are leaving Louisiana. But we have no real direct way of being able to do very much, for good or ill.
Okay. I'd like to move to another topic. You've published an essay called "What is Clean Energy?" and reading this, you come across as quite anti-nuclear. So I'd like to maybe challenge some of the statements that you've made, because from the rational point of view, I've basically looked at the issues, and as my background is in physics, and the energy density of nuclear provides a lot of benefit with a minimum of environmental footprint, from what I can see. I've come to the realization that the public kind of holds nuclear energy to a different standard than other energy sources. There's a fear factor around the high-profile accidents, similar to what you get from airliner crashes versus driving. Although they're high-profile, very rare events. But if you look at the numbers, they're still safer on average per unit power than other methods of generating them. In your essay, anyways, you state that nuclear technology is associated with the generation of large volumes of exceptionally hazardous and difficult to manage wastes. Now, most assessment that I've seen suggests that nuclear energy uses less mining and materials per kilowatt hour than any other power source, and this is because of the extremely high power density. What metrics would you use to compare hazard level and waste volumes amongst power sources? And why does this place nuclear, in your opinion, as a bad choice?
Well, I actually did a life cycle sustainability assessment on nuclear when I was working at the Pembina Institute. So we had a fairly thorough look at this. On the waste side, you have to look at it life cycle, and therefore you have to be looking at the fuel cycle especially. And what was very striking was the volume and the nature of the waste from uranium mining, especially, which again falls into this category of being exceptionally hazardous and exceptionally difficult to manage. It is the only mining waste stream that has actually been found to be toxic for the purposes of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act by Environment Canada and Health Canada. So that's a unique status. The standard figures on uranium mine tailing management you're looking at containments needing to function on timescales of 250,000 years or so. It's been the figure, because you're dealing with something that is semi-liquid. You've got all the usual problems you would have with mine tailings, with the additional feature that it's also radioactive.
Before you move on, you said that it's the only mining waste stream that's toxic?
It's classified as been found to be toxic for the purposes of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act.
What's that based on?
Well, that was based on the assessment that Health Canada and Environment Canada did.
So, this is compared to gold mining, where they use acid leaching and...
Well, remember, uranium mine tailings are acidic too. And in some cases, now in Canada, we don't leach uranium, but we do, and it's done in other places. As part of the priority substances list process under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, the federal government did undertake a toxicity assessment of uranium mine tailings. And that was the conclusion, that this is the only one that's actually been classified as SEPA toxic in the language of the Act.
Has that focus been placed on other mining systems, though?
They've looked at, they had not done a toxicity assessment, but this was interestingly, the determination was mostly based on chemical toxicity, and it was actually the presence of the chemical toxicity around uranium, which I didn't know myself, but that was the basis of that conclusion. So again, with uranium in Canada, you're dealing with the same stuff you would be dealing with any hard rock mining operation in terms of what the nature of the tailings are. And they're going to tend to be acidic, and they're going to tend to contain heavy metals and other things. But you also then have this additional dimension of both the chemical toxicity of the uranium portion, and also the fact that you're dealing with stuff that is radioactive in a way that other tailings aren't. So that was where we landed. That was where Health Canada and Environment Canada landed in terms of that assessment. There have been other concerns raised too, particularly about radionuclides in food chains. There's particular pathways involving country foods in the vicinity of uranium mines. So this struck us as already problematic at the top end of the fuel cycle. And then, of course, you've got various things through the processes. It was also, we were surprised at the levels of air pollution also associated with the mine mill operations, which we didn't know when we went into this. So that was quite interesting. And then, of course, you got the back end problem of the waste fuel. And, NWMO says, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization says, well, we're looking at a 1,000,000-year timescale. That this stuff is going to have to be actively managed. So, that from our perspective at the time, looking at it through a sustainability lens, that was one area of that the fuel cycle seemed to us very problematic.
I could see if you think that you need to manage this actively for 1,000,000 years, why you might come to that conclusion.
Well, that's what NWM. That was what the Nuclear Waste Management Organization said. Was we're looking at a 1,000,000-year time frame.
The problem, I think, is that nuclear is the only power source that is applied the precautionary principle amongst all other power sources in terms of its radiation levels and the danger of radiation levels. Are set using the ALARA principle, which is as low as reasonably achievable, even though the medical data doesn't back up the dangerousness of the requirements placed upon NWMO are not backed up by medical data. So the linear no threshold theorem that says that any radiation effect is dangerous at a certain level, although measurements from radiation testing show that anything below about 100 millisieverts does not measurably increase your health risk. And you could compare this to, say, what I've done at least is looking at particulate matter in the atmosphere, say from fossil fuel burning, PM 2.5, which we know has a mortality rate at 10 micrograms per cubic meter, which is present in every city in the world effectively. Yet we don't feel this needs to be buried in the ground for 1 million years. We can breathe this in and license these plants. There seems to be an asymmetry in the policy that suggests that something that is below the level of, like the nuclear waste, for example, is that radiotoxicity is below the level of the original ore after about 300 years in Candu, especially because it's not very hot compared to the enriched stuff. So at 300 years, you can put it back in the ground where it was, and it's less toxic than what it was there in the ground. So it seems to be there's a disconnect in what people are trying to do with this.
Well, I think there are multiple dimensions. I mean, at the end of the day, the NWMO, which is the federal agency that was given the job of dealing with this stuff, the million-year time scale is theirs. That's where they came out on this. Keeping in mind that they're thinking about this in multiple dimensions. It's the biophysical hazards of the material in and of itself. But then there are also the security issues that you could make a lot of trouble with waste nuclear fuel if you were inclined to do so. You don't have to build a bomb. There are other ways of causing trouble. There are concerns in the longer term. I mean, part of the concern has been the timescales. And, even 300 years. In 1722, there wasn't much of Canada. And who knows where you are where would we be? 23, 22. That's, from a security, from a societal perspective, I mean, these were all issues that were raised by the Seaborne Commission when it did its work in the late 1980s, first starting to think about this, is that there's the biophysical hazards around which, the biggest, assuming you did deep underground, probably groundwater issues are probably the most significant, although, who knows. But the other issues they were dealing with were also these questions of security and access and all kinds of other stuff as well. So that's where they landed, and you're faced with the problem at this stage that nobody wants the stuff, and nobody wants to be host. And from our perspective, I mean, we looked at this in a sustainability context, in which case, intergenerational transfers of those kinds of risks is generally a non-starter. Those kinds of timescales is generally regarded as a not okay. And that was that was only one dimension of the analysis we did. But that one was, in our minds, quite problematic, given that you also have other potential sources which don't have these fuel cycle problems. That's just the biophysical problems. There's other dimensions of that as well.
I think there's been a focus on nuclear to the exclusion of other problems in other industries. Like if you look at hydro dams, for example, you have methyl mercury being added to the food chain. This bioaccumulates a neurotoxin, which is known to kill people. But no one is suggesting that hydro dam operators should capture all the methyl mercury that's created in their reservoirs and bury it for infinity years, or however long it takes for the methyl mercury to it's an element, right? It's not going to go away. It's there forever. So discussions of 1 million years or 250 million years compared to infinity is negligible.
Well, I mean, the form of the methyl mercury you get from a hydro dam is notable in terms of its potential for biological uptake. But I agree. I mean, and if you look at the analysis we did at the time, and we flagged issues with large hydro as well. I mean, the practice is, I mean, there's all kinds of issues that arise there in terms of impacts on indigenous communities as well. Um, the practice around dam construction, I mean, clear cut to try and reduce the amount of biological material that gets submerged, and that's the source of the methyl mercury. No, I mean, there are impacts with other sources too, and large hydro is one where you have to ask questions, big questions about, I mean, and there's been a push back towards large hydro in the context of electrification, and we need to think about that one carefully. Certainly, we didn't take the view in the analysis. We did a larger analysis as well that looked at a range of different technologies. That these are not without downsides themselves. The question was where did the trade-offs lie? And with nuclear, we did feel that there were certain things that were unique to the technology and uniquely problematic, which was part of where we, what led us to our conclusions, of which, the waste streams up and downstream are clearly part of that conversation. There are catastrophic event risks, and the fact is they're not hypothetical. We've lived through 2.5 of those, might be the best way to put it. I mean, Chernobyl and Fukushima, and then 3 Mile Island, semi-successful accident, I guess you might call it. And then, of course, now we've had these security concerns, which have existed but never been as acute as now what we're seeing in Ukraine. So these are all, from those perspectives, and again, these are problems that really don't exist with other technologies in the same way.
No,
So
no, I don't think that's true.
I don't know.
I think Zaporizhia Dam was destroyed in World War II and killed 100,000 people, and the dams are now being mined right now. So we have evidence that the dams kill more people, that when they're damaged, they drown more people. We have, nobody's questioning hydro dams as much as they're questioning nuclear. They're saying it's a unique problem, but it's not a unique problem. It's very similar in terms of the scale, of casualties. If you look at the science on Chernobyl and the UN UNSCEAR reports on casualties, they can trace about 100 casualties to the Chernobyl explosion and fire. From acute radiation and from thyroid cancer, there were 15 deaths, I think. And, even if you use the linear no threshold theory to predict exposure at low levels of high numbers of people, they can only guess that about 4,000 people total will die from solid cancers, but they haven't seen any increase. And Fukushima, nobody died from the radiation. It was all from the response of the radiophobia of evacuating old people that didn't need to be evacuated in retrospect. So it seems like these things are being overblown. And I get your point. The NWMO saying that we need to actively manage this for a million years is really shooting itself. It's the industry shooting itself in the foot, agreeing to these regulations that are so much higher in terms of the health level impacts compared to other power industries like hydro and coal and even natural gas, which causes smog and kills orders of magnitude more people than all of the nuclear accidents that we've seen. So it's definitely I think something that we have to take into consideration, how these things have been presented to the public and how we've ramped up the regulations due to fear.
Well, although, in our larger sustainability framework, the bottom line we ended up with is, well, you need to avoid these kind of catastrophic accident risks. And you need to find the pathways that avoid them. And we've flagged this around large hydro as well as nuclear, that that there are complications with those pathways, which may make them unattractive. was sort of where we landed on a lot of this. Is that you need to this is one of the criteria. I'm not going to get too much into technical details around Chernobyl, but these are not events we want to have happening, no matter what. And the fact that they're realized is very significant. I mean, and there are also all kinds of debates about radiological standards and about tritium and other things, which I don't want to, we can get into if we need to, but I've just, and then, there's a whole other set of questions around the economics of the technology, which was a large part of our assessment as well. But my own view is I'm not enthusiastic about that pathway, given the trade-offs that exist, and that which the implication of which is that the bar to go there needs to be pretty high, and we need to be convinced that we don't have any other choices. And at this stage of the game, I'm not convinced of that at all. I think there's a lot happening technologically in the electricity sector at an incredible pace these days, which are opening up possibilities that, 50 years ago when Amory Lovins talked about soft paths, it was a notion and a dream. Now people are doing distributed resources on large scales. So there's lots of possibilities out there that we need to think through. And my concern is more that, rather than getting into a technologically specific conversation, is more at the moment in Ontario, for example, we don't seem to have any way to have that conversation about what really are our viable alternatives and where do we want to go. If we could have that discussion and we reach a point where, okay, maybe we don't have much choice but to do a life extension on Bruce and Pickering, or Bruce and Darlington, I think I'd feel a little better about it. That okay, we thought seriously about how far could we push efficiency, how far could we get on renewables, how far can we get in a relationship with Quebec, how far could we get with distributed resources. And after we thought about that, and we still come to the conclusion, okay, we're going to, in terms of where we need to get to in decarbonization, then I think we have more of a basis for a conversation about, is it rational to do, life extensions and refurbishments and other things on the existing units. And part of my concern is we just haven't had that conversation yet, where we've sort of, is this the choice we need to make? That's the part that worries me the most in some ways, is that we need to get there first.
Yeah, it's a highly polarized issue, and politicians are afraid of dipping their toes into such situations where you have this polarized thing where potentially protesters could come and mess up your re-election chances. So it's difficult to have these discussions, I think, and I think it behooves all of us as experts in this field to take these challenges on. And from my perspective, at least, people are recognizing that we're in a climate emergency, and I think in my perspective, some of the risks are overblown from nuclear. I'm definitely behind the fact of not shutting down existing reactors is the first thing that we should be doing. So I'm very happy that they've extended the Pickering reactor. I think that's crucial. In looking at the scale of the energy transition, we need another 98 CANDU 6 reactors to electrify all of Canada's transportation sectors and the heating. That's the scale of the issue, and it's we need all of the tools in our tool belt, in my opinion. Obviously, we need to have these discussions about what's the most economic and what's the most efficient spending of our dollars. So I appreciate your feedbacks on where you think we should be heading as well.
Yeah, no, I think my argument has been more broadly that you need to be looking critically at your tools, though, before you charge down too many paths, because some of them are unlikely to work. Some of them carry lock-in and other risks that we want to be a little bit careful about. And we want to think about, is that really where we have to go? before we charge down those pathways. And at the moment, we seem to, in my view, doing a lot of charging and not enough thinking. But that's where we seem to be at the moment. I mean, there's a lot of questionable money or questionable investments flying around.
Yes.
And we need to be thinking a little more critically about where are we throwing dollars, and committing to pathways that could turn out to be either dead ends, or even more worrying is hard to get off if they don't work out. So we need to think about those things in those terms as we go forward.
I just wanted to do a little fact check on some of the statements that we heard from Professor Winfield about the NWMO, which is Canada's National Waste Management Organization, charged with maintaining the spent nuclear fuel safely. Looking at their website, it turns out that there are they had 23 communities that requested hosting the Deep Geological Repository. Of these, two, they've narrowed it down to two: South Ignace and South Bruce. And these two are vying for hosting the Deep Geological Repository. It's not, nowhere on their website does it say that it'll be actively managed for 250,000 years. The plan is to place nuclear fuel in the depository over a period of about 40 years. The project is completed in 175 years at the outside, costing $26 billion. Total over that 175 years. They already have $5.5 billion set aside for this from trust fund deposits from companies that are generating the waste. And then by putting it in the Deep Geological Repository, it remains geologically isolated from the surface for periods of hundreds of thousands to millions of years. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today, and thank you for coming on the show. I'm going to send you a T-shirt if you'd like, for taking the time to chat with us. So I appreciate your time today, Professor Winfield.
Well, great. It was a very, very interesting conversation. That was very useful. Thanks, Al.
Thank you.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Thanks for listening.